Imagine for a moment that you are standing at an altitude where the air itself feels like a razor blade against the back of your throat. You are 16,500 feet above sea level, deep within the jagged, unforgiving teeth of the Indian Himalayas. Here, the oxygen is so thin that every heartbeat feels like a desperate plea, and the silence is so profound that you can hear the blood rushing through your own veins. You are standing on the edge of a small, bowl-shaped glacial tarn known as Roopkund. For most of the year, this place is a tomb of ice and snow, a white void where nothing lives and nothing grows. But then, the sun of a particularly warm summer touches the surface, the ice retreats, and the water clears. As you peer into the emerald depths of the melting pond, you realize you are not alone. Staring back at you through the crystalline water and the shifting slush are hundreds of human skulls. They are not tucked away in graves or hidden in caves. They are everywhere. They are scattered across the banks, wedged between the jagged rocks, and layered deep within the silt of the lake bed. Some still have hair clinging to their scalps. Others still wear the tattered remnants of leather sandals. This is not a graveyard built by human hands. It is a frozen snapshot of a forgotten catastrophe. The story of Roopkund Lake does not begin with its creation, but with its rediscovery in a time of global upheaval. It was 1942. The world was consumed by the fires of World War II, and the British Empire, which then ruled over India, was gripped by a mounting sense of paranoia. The Japanese Imperial Army was making significant gains in Southeast Asia, and there were whispers that they might attempt a daring clandestine invasion through the mountain passes of the north. In this atmosphere of high-tension surveillance, a forest ranger named Hari Kishan Madwal was tasked with patrolling the high-altitude wilderness of the Nanda Devi Game Reserve. Madwal was a man of the mountains, used to the thin air and the treacherous terrain, but even for a seasoned ranger, the trek to the Roopkund Basin was an ordeal. It required navigating the Trishul Massif, a trio of peaks named after the trident of the god Shiva, where the weather can turn from a shimmering blue sky to a blinding whiteout in a matter of minutes. When Madwal finally reached the rim of the basin that summer, he expected to find nothing more than the usual stark beauty of the glacial landscape. Instead, he found a nightmare. As the ice of the lake began its seasonal thaw, it revealed a charnel house of epic proportions. Madwal saw bones protruding from the slush, polished white by the sun and the wind. He saw rib cages tangled in the rocks and limbs half submerged in the frigid water. The sheer volume of the remains was staggering. Estimates would later suggest that between 300 and 800 individuals lay within and around the small lake. For a forest ranger in 1942, the immediate conclusion was a terrifying one. He believed he had stumbled upon the remnants of a secret Japanese scouting party that had perished while attempting to cross the mountains to strike at the heart of British India. Madwal Haport traveled down the mountain, through the bureaucratic layers of the colonial administration, eventually reaching the ears of the British military authorities. To the generals in New Delhi, this was a matter of national security. If a battalion-sized force had managed to get this far into the interior, the northern border was far more porous than they had imagined. A team of investigators was dispatched to the site, struggling up the vertical slopes to reach the macabre tarn. However, when they arrived and began to examine the remains, their fear of a Japanese invasion slowly evaporated, replaced by a much deeper, more ancient mystery. The bones were not fresh, they were old, very old. The clothing was not made of modern military wool or synthetic fibers, but of coarse hand-woven cotton and primitive leather. These were not soldiers of the 20th century, they were travelers from a different era entirely. The discovery sent ripples through the scientific community of the time, though the limitations of 1940s technology meant that many questions remained unanswered. The skeletons were remarkably well preserved. The cold, dry air of the high Himalayas and the icy alkaline water of the lake had acted as a natural freezer, preventing the total decay of organic matter. Some of the bodies still possessed desiccated flesh, and in some cases the internal organs were partially intact. This preservation gave the site an eerie, lifelike quality, as if the victims had only recently fallen where they lay. Yet as the years passed and the war ended, the skeleton lake of Roopkund faded from the headlines, lingering only as a local legend among the hill tribes of the Garhwal region. These locals, however, were not surprised by the discovery. To them, the skeletons were not a mystery to be solved by science, but a cautionary tale of divine wrath. The local folklore speaks of a great pilgrimage, the Nanda Devi Rajjat, which takes place every 12 years to honor the goddess Nanda Devi, the consort of Shiva and the protector of the mountains. According to the legend, a medieval king named Raja Jajdfal of Kanuj decided to undertake this sacred journey. However, the king was arrogant and disregarded the strict spiritual protocols required for the trek. He insisted on bringing a lavish entourage, including his pregnant wife, Queen Balpa, as well as dancers, musicians, and servants. The goddess Nanda Devi, offended by the noise, the waste, and the king's hubris in bringing a pregnant woman to her sacred high-altitude abode, unleashed a terrible fury upon the party. The legend says she rained down iron balls from the sky, striking the pilgrims dead where they stood and casting their bodies into the lake. For decades, the iron ball theory was dismissed by historians as mere religious allegory, a way for the local population to explain a tragic but mundane event like an epidemic or sudden blizzard. But as the mid-20th century progressed and forensic techniques improved, the physical evidence began to tell a story that bore a haunting resemblance to the myth. When the bones were finally subjected to more rigorous carbon dating and osteological analysis in the 1950s and 60s, the initial estimate suggested the remains were roughly 500 to 800 years old. This timeline roughly aligned with the era of the legendary king of Connaught. More importantly, the physical trauma on the skulls was peculiar. They didn't show the jagged fractures of a fall or the clean cuts of a sword. Instead, many of the skulls exhibited small, deep, rounded depressions, the kind of marks that would be made by something heavy and spherical falling from a great height. The site itself is a geographical anomaly. Roopkund is not on any established trade route. It is a dead end, a high-altitude cul-de-sac that leads only to the glaciers of the Trishul Massif. Why would hundreds of people, including women and children, be in such a remote and dangerous place? The pilgrimage theory seemed the most plausible, yet it didn't explain the presence of different groups or the sheer scale of the death toll. As more researchers visited the site, they found more than just bones. They found bamboo staves, iron spearheads, and small pieces of jewelry. They found that the victims were generally healthy and well-nourished before their deaths, ruling out a slow demise by starvation or a lingering plague. They had died suddenly, all at once, in a moment of extreme violence that had been frozen in time. But history is rarely as simple as a single event, and the Lake of Skeletons was about to prove that it was much more complex than a medieval king's hubris. Just as the world felt it had a grip on the mystery, the theory of a 9th century pilgrimage caught in a freak hailstorm, new evidence began to emerge that would shatter every assumption previously made. The bones of Roopkund were not a single group, they were not from a single time, and some of them, shockingly, were not even from the Indian subcontinent. As we look closer at the silt and the ice, we find that the tragedy of Roopkund is not one story, but a tapestry of many, woven together by a mountain that refuses to let its secrets go easily. The mountain had many more secrets to tell.
The mountain had many more secrets to tell. These secrets began to emerge not from the ice itself, but from the sterile, brightly lit laboratories of the Center for Cellular and Molecular Biology in Hyderabad and the Reich Lab at Harvard Medical School. For decades, the skeletons of Roopkund were treated as a monolithic entity, a single tragic event frozen in time. But in 2019, a massive international study involving 28 institutions across the globe published findings that would effectively rewrite the history of the lake. They performed a full genomic analysis on 38 sets of remains, and what they found was nothing short of a chronological and geographical nightmare for traditional historians. The bones did not belong to one group of people. Instead, the analysis revealed 3 distinct genetic clusters that had arrived at the lake at vastly different times. The first cluster, Group A, consisted of 23 individuals whose DNA was consistent with populations found in present-day South Asia. This group seemed to fit the traditional narrative, but even they were not a singular, homogeneous unit. They belonged to various subgroups from across the Indian subcontinent, suggesting a diverse collection of people rather than a single family or a small village. But it was Group B that sent shockwaves through the scientific community. This group consisted of 14 individuals whose genetic markers did not point to India or even to neighboring Tibet or Nepal. Instead, their DNA most closely matched individuals from the Eastern Mediterranean, specifically modern-day Greece and the island of Crete. The final individual, labeled Group C, possessed ancestry related to East Asia. The existence of Mediterranean DNA at 16,000 feet in a remote Himalayan crevice was baffling enough, but the temporal data provided by radiocarbon dating made the mystery even more profound. Historians had long assumed that all the victims had perished in a single 9th century event, perhaps the legendary pilgrimage of King Jastawal. The South Asian individuals did indeed date to roughly 800 AD, consistent with that period of history. However, the Mediterranean group had not died in the 9th century. They had died nearly 1,000 years later, around 1800 AD. This revelation shattered the idea of a single tragedy. The lake was not a snapshot of one bad day in history. It was a recurring site of death, a place where different people from different worlds came to die, separated by a millennium of human progress. The presence of the Mediterranean group in the early 19th century is particularly haunting because there is absolutely no historical record of a group of Europeans traveling to such a remote, high-altitude location in the Garhwal Himalayas during that time. This was not a military expedition of the British Raj, nor was it a recorded scientific survey. The individuals in Group B were men and women, ranging from children to the elderly, which suggests a traveling party or a family group, rather than a scouting mission or a band of traders. To reach Roopkund, they would have had to navigate some of the most treacherous terrain on Earth, far away from any established trade routes or known mountain passes. Why they were there remains one of the most frustrating gaps in the historical record.
To dig deeper into their lives, scientists turned to stable isotope analysis. By examining the chemical signatures locked within the tooth enamel of the victims, researchers could determine what these people ate during their childhoods and where they might have lived. The South Asian group showed a diet rich in C4 plants, like millet, which is consistent with the agricultural practices of the Indian interior. However, the Mediterranean group showed a diet more reliant on C3 plants, such as wheat and barley, further confirming their non-local origins. Even more fascinating was the oxygen isotope data, which provides a signature of the water an individual drank while their teeth were forming. The oxygen levels in the Mediterranean group's teeth were entirely inconsistent with the high-altitude environment of the Himalayas, proving they were newcomers to the region when they met their end. This multi-generational, multi-ethnic collection of bones paints a picture of Roopkund as a dead end for travelers across the ages. The lake sits in a bowl-shaped depression, surrounded by steep, crumbling ridges. It is a place of thin air and unpredictable weather, where a clear blue sky can turn into a lethal whiteout in a matter of minutes. The discovery that people were dying here in distinct clusters over a span of 1,000 years suggests that the mountain itself acts as a trap. But the question of how they die brings us back to the physical evidence on the bones themselves. When the 1942 forest ranger first found the site, he noted that many of the skulls possessed peculiar fractures. Unlike the trauma one might see from a fall or a battle, these injuries were localized to the tops of the heads. There were no defensive wounds on the forearms, no broken ribs that would suggest a tumble down a rocky slope, and no signs of sharp force trauma from swords or spears. The wounds were the result of blunt force impact delivered directly above. This led to the revival of the local folk song's warning. The goddess Nanda Devi, enraged by the desecration of her sanctuary, rained down hailstones hard as iron. Meteorologically, this is not as far-fetched as it sounds. The Himalayas are known for producing catastrophic hailstorms, where stones the size of cricket balls can fall with terminal velocity. In an open area like the shores of Roopkund, with no trees for shelter and no caves to hide in, a sudden barrage of massive ice would be inescapable. For the 9th century pilgrims caught in the open during their religious procession, the sky itself became a weapon. The ice would have struck their heads and shoulders with enough force to crack bone, leading to internal bleeding, concussion, and rapid death in the freezing temperatures. Yet, if the 9th century group died in a hailstorm, did the 19th century Mediterranean group suffer the same fate? It seems statistically improbable that two different groups, separated by 1,000 years, would both be wiped out by the exact same rare weather phenomenon at the exact same tiny lake. And yet the bone trauma across both groups remains eerily similar. This raises the possibility that the hailstorm might be a poetic interpretation of something else, or perhaps a testament to the sheer lethality of the high-altitude microclimate. As we look at the logistics of the 1800s group, the mystery deepens. During that period, the Garhwal region was embroiled in various geopolitical shifts, yet none of the colonial records mention a missing party of Mediterranean travelers. If 14 people from the eastern Mediterranean had vanished in the mountains, surely someone would have noticed. They carried no weapons, no specialized mountain gear that survived, and no coins that could definitively link them to a specific city-state or kingdom. They were ghosts in the landscape, identified only by the sequences of their DNA. The boring history of Roopkund is a lesson in the fallibility of early archaeology. In the mid-20th century, we wanted a single answer, a single tragedy, a single king, a single storm. We forced the evidence to fit a narrative that was comfortable. But the truth is far more chaotic. The lake is a palimpsest, a parchment that has been written upon, erased, and rewritten by the mountain. Each layer of bone represents a different era of human movement, a different motivation for being in the high altitudes, and perhaps a different reason for failing to return. We must also consider the role of the lake itself. Roopkund is not a permanent grave, it is a seasonal one. For most of the years, the bodies are buried under meters of snow and ice, preserved in a natural deep freeze that halts decomposition. It is only during the brief summer thaw that the skeleton lake reveals its contents. This cycle of freezing and thawing has likely shifted the remains, mixing the bones of a 9th century priest with those of a 19th century traveler, creating the illusion of a single mass death event. The silt at the bottom of the lake is a mixture of centuries of human history, ground down by the pressure of the ice. As researchers began to separate these timelines, they realized that they weren't just looking for one cause of death. They were looking for the reason why the Himalayas, and this specific peak of Nanda Gunti, exerted such a pull on people from as far away as Crete. Was there a lost trade route? Was it a pilgrimage that transcended cultures? Or were these travelers simply victims of the mountain's cruel geography, led astray by a past that looked promising but led only to a frozen dead end? The more we learn about the DNA and the dates, the less we seem to know about the people themselves. They remain silhouettes against the snow, their stories silenced by the thin air. But there is one more detail, often overlooked in the rush to analyze DNA and carbon isotopes. Among the bones scattered in the freezing mud were artifacts. Not gold or jewels, but the mundane items of daily life. Wooden handles, iron spearheads that didn't match the wounds, and fragments of bamboo. And then there was the leather. Shoes remarkably preserved by the cold, that could tell us more about where these people had walked than their genes ever could. As scientists turned their attention from the bones to the belongings, a new and even more disturbing possibility began to take shape. The tragedy was not just in how they died, but in what they were carrying with them, and what they were desperately trying to leave behind.
The leather, though stiffened by a millennium of frost and the caustic chemistry of the mountain soil, tells a story of pride, and perhaps of profound misplaced confidence. When archaeologists first handled these fragments, they expected the rugged, fur-lined boots of high-altitude traders, or the sturdy, grass-woven sandals used by local porters for centuries. Instead, they found something far more puzzling. Many of the shoes recovered from the silt were surprisingly delicate, constructed with thin soles and intricate stitching that suggested a life lived on paved streets or soft forest floors, rather than the jagged, vertical staircase of the Himalayas. These were not the tools of people who respected the mountain. They were the belongings of people who were passing through it, perhaps underestimating the price the terrain would eventually demand. This realization shifted the focus of the investigation from the biology of the victims to their burdens. Scattered among the ribs and pelvic bones were the skeletons of things: bamboo staves, iron spearheads, and the remains of small ornate parasols. In any other context, a parasol is a symbol of status or ritual, a shield against the sun, or a mark of a dignitary. At 16,000 feet, amidst the howling winds of a glacial cirque, a parasol is a liability, a fragile, wind-catching sail that would be useless in a storm. Yet, these items were found in abundance. For the group that died in the 9th century, the South Asian pilgrims, these artifacts fit a known narrative. They were likely participants in the Nanda Devi Raj Jat, a grueling pilgrimage that occurs once every 12 years. To them, the bamboo and the umbrellas were not just luggage. They were sacred offerings, part of a tradition that viewed the arduous climb as a necessary purification. They carried their faith in their hands, even as the air grew too thin to breathe. But when we turn our gaze to the second group, the Mediterranean travelers who arrived nearly 1,000 years later, around 1800 AD, the artifacts become far more haunting. DNA analysis confirmed that these 14 individuals were not locals, nor were they related to the pilgrims who had perished in the same spot centuries earlier. They were genetically linked to the people of mainland Greece and Crete. The presence of Europeans in this remote, high-altitude pocket of the Garhwal Himalayas during the early 19th century is a historical anomaly that defies easy explanation. They weren't part of any known British colonial expedition, nor were they recorded in the meticulous logs of the Great Trigonometrical Survey that was mapping India at the time. They were ghosts in the machinery of history, and the items they carried suggested they were not prepared for a mountain crossing. The leather of their footwear was different, sturdier than the 9th century sandals, but utterly inadequate for the shifting scree and ice of Roopkund. They carried iron tools, yet none of these were the heavy axes or pitons required for alpine survival. Instead, they were smaller, more domestic. As the researchers looked closer at the chemical signatures in the bones and the wear on the artifacts, a disturbing pattern emerged. This was not a military unit or a scouting party of young, fit men. It was a diverse group, including women and elderly individuals. They were traveling as a community, and it is here that the artifacts begin to whisper a different kind of tragedy. If they were not pilgrims and they were not soldiers, what were they? One theory posits that they were a group of displaced persons, perhaps merchants or families caught in the geopolitical upheavals of the Napoleonic era, looking for a way across the roof of the world to find a new life or escape a pursuing shadow. They were carrying their lives with them, the iron trinkets, the specific clothes of their homeland, the memories of a Mediterranean sun that had no business reflecting off a Himalayan glacier. They were moving through a landscape that was fundamentally alien to them, guided perhaps by a local scout who promised a shortcut through the mountains, a secret pass that would bypass the checkpoints of the lower valleys. The wooden handles mentioned in early reports were later identified as parts of transport frames, the kind used to carry heavy loads or perhaps even people who could no longer walk. This suggests a slow, agonizing progression. They weren't rushing towards the lake. They were dragging themselves towards it. The iron spearheads, which initially suggested a forgotten battle, showed no signs of being used in combat. There were no parry marks on the shafts, no nicks in the metal from clashing with other blades. Instead, the spearheads were found neatly tucked away, or still attached to poles that were being used as makeshift walking sticks. These people weren't looking for a fight. They were using their weapons as crutches. As the scientists meticulously mapped the position of every leather scrap and iron tip, the spatial distribution revealed a chilling truth. The bodies and their belongings weren't clustered in a way that suggested a camp or a planned rest stop. They were strung out in a line of desperation, a trail of discarded weight that ended at the water's edge. Imagine the scene. A group of people, already exhausted and suffering from the early stages of hypoxia, realize that the promising path they followed has led them into a topographical trap. The lake is a dead end, a natural amphitheater of rock and ice with no easy exit. To go back was to face whatever they were fleeing. To stay was to freeze.
In their final hours, it seems they began to shed the very things that define them. We find pieces of jewelry, small beads and rings, pressed into the mud, not lost in a struggle, but perhaps dropped as their fingers grew too numb to hold them. The leather shoes were found some distance from the feet they once protected, a common and eerie symptom of paradoxical undressing associated with extreme hypothermia. In the terminal stages of freezing, the brain malfunctions, making the victim feel as though they are burning up, prompting them to strip off their clothes in a final, fatal act of confusion. The artifacts tell us that the tragedy of Roopkund was not a singular event of violence, but a slow-motion collapse of hope. The 1800s group, these Mediterranean wanderers, were carrying the mundane items of daily life because they expected those items to have a future. You do not carry a wooden-handled utensil or a decorative iron piece if you know you are walking into your grave. You carry them because they are the anchors of your identity. By the time they reached the lake, those anchors had become weights. The most disturbing possibility, however, lies in what was missing. Despite the presence of iron and bamboo, there were no containers for significant amounts of food, no large-scale cooking vessels, no heavy grain sacks. This suggests that by the time they reached the high altitude of the lake, they were already starving. They were running on nothing but the adrenaline of escape and the fading strength of their own bodies. The tragedy was not just the storm that eventually took them, but the series of choices that made them believe they could survive such a crossing with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the remnants of a life they were trying to leave behind. As the wind howls across the lake today, it carries the same biting chill that those travelers felt 2 centuries ago. The artifacts, now mostly removed to the safety of museums or lost to the backpacks of unscrupulous tourists, once formed a silent testimony to a cross-continental journey that ended in the most lonely place on Earth. The DNA tells us who they were, but the artifacts tell us who they wanted to be, people who could walk through a mountain range and emerge on the other side with their heritage intact. They failed, and in the silence of the lake, the only thing that remains is the cold, hard evidence of their struggle, a discarded shoe, a broken spear, and the heavy, invisible burden of a history that was never meant to be found. But the story is not yet complete. For all the artifacts can tell us about their life, they cannot explain the final, terrifying moment of their death, a moment that left its mark not just on the leather and the iron, but on the very shape of the bones themselves. To understand the end, we must look at the sky.
The sky above the Garhwal Himalayas is not merely a backdrop for the jagged peaks of Trishul and Nandagunti. It is a volatile atmospheric theater where the weather can transition from a crystalline blue to a lethal gray in a matter of minutes. In the high-altitude basin of Roopkund, at over 16,000 feet, the air is thin enough to starve the brain of oxygen, but it is the movements of the clouds above that provide the final, definitive clue to the tragedy that unfolded here over a millennium ago. When forensic scientists and anthropologists finally turned their attention from the DNA and the artifacts to the physical trauma preserved on the skeletons themselves, they discovered a pattern that was as consistent as it was horrifying. Nearly every skull recovered from the icy slush of the lake exhibited the same specific type of injury: short, deep, unhealed cracks. These were not the jagged, radiating fractures typical of a fall from a height, nor were they the result of a crushing weight like an